It was a day that began like any other spring Sunday across the Midwest, a morning touched with warmth and a sky that promised nothing more than an ordinary afternoon. April 11th, 1965, Palm Sunday, and in towns from Iowa to Indiana, families were gathering for church services, children clutching palm fronds, and the air was filled with hymns and the scent of lilies. No one looked up and saw the danger that was brewing. No one knew that by the time the final hymn was sung, the sky would turn a sickly green, the wind would begin to scream, and the world as they knew it would be ripped apart. This is the story of the Palm Sunday Outbreak, a day when the heavens opened and the earth rose up to meet them in fury. Over the course of that single afternoon and evening, more than 100 tornadoes touched down across 6 states, killing 271 people and injuring thousands more. Among them were some of the most violent ever recorded, storms that defied anything meteorologists thought possible at the time. And it all started with a simple shift in the weather, a warm front that slid up from the Gulf of Mexico, meeting a cold mass of air sweeping down from Canada. It was a collision that would set the stage for catastrophe. The morning of Palm Sunday, the weather across the Midwest was deceptively calm. The temperature climbed into the 70s, a balmy spring day that lured people outside. In towns like Dunlap, Indiana, and Pittstown, New Jersey, people opened their windows, aired out their houses, and thought about the evening meal. In Elkhart, Indiana, a young couple named Frank and Mary were looking forward to having Frank's parents over for dinner after church. Mary had put a roast in the oven early that morning, and the smell of it filled the little house on the corner of Main Street. Frank was tinkering with the lawnmower in the garage, trying to get it started for the first time that year. Their 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 9, were playing in the backyard, chasing each other through the daffodils. It was a scene of perfect, ordinary happiness. No one in that house, or in any of the houses up and down that street, had any idea that by 4 o'clock that afternoon, their lives would be scattered across a field half a mile away. The meteorologists of the day were not blind to the threat. The U.S. Weather Bureau had been tracking a powerful storm system that was gathering strength over the Great Plains. They had issued a bulletin early that morning, warning of possible severe thunderstorms and isolated tornadoes, but it was a general warning, the kind of thing that had been issued 100 times before. There was no radar network like we have today. There were no tornado watches broadcast on television or radio with maps and warnings. The only tool the public had was the local weather forecast, and on that Sunday the forecasters were talking about rain, maybe a thunderstorm later in the day, but nothing that would make anyone cancel the church picnic. The science of tornado prediction was still in its infancy. The term tornado itself was almost taboo in some places. Forecasters avoided using it for fear of causing panic. And so the people of the Midwest went about their Palm Sunday routines, unaware that the sky was loading its gun. The first tornado touched down at just after 11:30 in the morning near the town of Nashua, Iowa. It was a modest storm by later standards, a twisting column of dust and debris that spun across open fields, uprooting a few trees and damaging a barn. No one was hurt. The second came about 40 minutes later near Waverly, Iowa, and it was stronger, tearing the roof off a farmhouse and flipping a tractor onto its side. The farmer who owned that tractor, a man named Earl Johnson, was in the field when the wind hit. He saw the funnel drop out of the sky and he ran for the barn, diving into the hayloft just as the walls collapsed around him. He survived with a broken arm and a head wound, but he lost everything else. His wife and 2 children were in the house when it was hit, and they made it to the storm cellar just in time. They would later say that the sound was like a freight train, a phrase that would be repeated 1,000 times over the next few hours. But those early storms were just the beginning, the 1-2 punches before the main fight. By noon, the atmosphere was primed. The temperature and dew point were rising. The wind shear was intensifying, and the storms that had been forming over Iowa and northern Illinois were beginning to rotate, spinning faster and faster like a top that had been given one final spin. The deadliest phase of the outbreak began around 1:30 in the afternoon when a massive tornado touched down near the town of Bern, Indiana. It was a monster, a wedge-shaped funnel that scraped the earth clean for miles. It moved at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour, and it carried debris so high that chunks of wood and metal were later found 30 miles away. The town of Dunlap was in its path. Dunlap was a small community of about 2,000 people nestled along the Elkhart River. It had a main street with a hardware store, a grocery, a post office, and a church. The church was packed that day for the Palm Sunday service. The choir had just finished singing Hosanna, loud Hosanna, when the power went out. The lights flickered and died, and the congregation sat in the sudden darkness, confused but not yet afraid. Then they heard it, the freight train. The pastor, Reverend Thomas Miller, later recalled that he saw the north wall of the church begin to bow inward, as if some invisible giant was pushing it with all his might. He shouted for everyone to get down, and then the wall exploded. The tornado ripped the roof off the church, then the walls collapsed outward like a flower opening. The pews were lifted and thrown, and people were sucked into the funnel. Reverend Miller was thrown against the altar and then into the choir loft, which had somehow remained standing. He crawled out of the rubble covered in dust and blood, and he looked around. The church was gone. The houses across the street were gone. The hardware store was a pile of splinters, and in the field behind what used to be the church, he saw bodies lying in the grass that survivors were pulling from the wreckage of the parking lot. 13 people died in that church. More than 60 were injured. And the tornado was not done. After destroying Dunlap, the storm turned northeast toward the town of Elkhart. It was the same storm that would later devastate the town of Goshen and then cross into Michigan, leaving a path of destruction 60 miles long. But it was the small towns that suffered the worst. In the house on Main Street in Elkhart, Frank had just finished fixing the lawnmower. He had started it up and let it run for a few seconds to make sure it was working, and the noise had covered the sound of the approaching wind. He was in the garage wiping grease off his hands when the door suddenly blew open. The pressure dropped and he felt his ears pop. He stepped outside and saw the sky. It was not a sky he had ever seen before. It was a dark, churning green, and from the southwest a black column was reaching down from the clouds, spinning so fast that it seemed to be humming. Frank shouted for Mary to get the kids into the basement. She was in the kitchen pulling the roast out of the oven when she heard him. She dropped the pan, grabbed the 3 children, and ran for the basement door. But the oldest boy, 9-year-old Jimmy, was still in the backyard. He had been playing with a red wagon, loading it with rocks. Mary screamed his name, but the wind tore her voice away. Frank ran around the side of the house, and he saw the tornado, now only a quarter-mile away. It was picking up trees and tossing them like twigs. He saw Jimmy standing there frozen, looking up at the funnel. Frank grabbed him by the arm and ran for the basement, the storm chasing them. They made it down the stairs just as the house above them shuddered and groaned. The walls buckled, the floor above them heaved, and then the house was gone, carried away like a handful of leaves. When they came out hours later, they found the neighborhood unrecognizable. The only thing left of their house was the concrete foundation and the basement steps. The roast was gone. Lawnmower was gone, but they were alive. The storm that hit Elkhart was one of several that afternoon. Across the region, the tornadoes were breeding. In Illinois, a tornado touched down near the town of Oregon, destroying a farm and killing a family of 6. In Wisconsin, a tornado swept through the town of Judah, killing 7. In Ohio, a tornado struck the town of Russia, and in Michigan, one hit the village of Waldron. It was as if the sky had decided to break into pieces, and each piece was a hammer. The towns that were hit were not just damaged, they were erased. In the days that followed, the survivors would tell stories that did not seem real. A man in Dunlap was thrown 300 feet into a pond and survived with only a broken leg. A woman in Goshen was holding her infant when the tornado lifted her out of her bathtub and deposited her in a cornfield half a mile away, still holding her baby who was unharmed. A milk truck in Bern was picked up and carried a quarter of a mile before being dropped upside down in a barn. The barn was also upside down. These were the stories that would be told and retold, and they were all true. But the worst was yet to come. As the afternoon wore on, the storms grew even stronger. The weathermen in Chicago and Indianapolis were now watching their instruments in disbelief. The barometric pressure was dropping to levels that had never been recorded in the United States during a tornado outbreak. The wind speeds at the upper levels of the atmosphere were clocking in at over 200 miles per hour, and the storms were moving fast, faster than anyone had ever seen them move. A tornado that touched down near the town of Midway, Indiana, would later be classified as an F5, the highest rating on the Fujita scale that did not yet exist. It was a storm that defied description. It was not a funnel, it was a wall of black that covered the entire horizon. It was a mile wide. It picked up a school bus and threw it into a grain silo, and the bus and the silo fused into a single mass of twisted metal. It swept a concrete bridge off its foundations and tossed it into a river. And when it was done, it had killed 23 people in a single stretch of county road. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the worst was over, but the damage was done. Across 6 states, more than 20,000 homes and buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The final death toll would be 271, but that number did not include the ones who died later in hospitals or the ones who were never found. The Palm Sunday outbreak was the deadliest tornado outbreak in U.S. history up to that point, and it would remain the deadliest until the 1974 super outbreak. But it was not just the numbers that made it a turning point. It was the way it changed how we think about tornadoes. Before that day, many people in the Midwest still believed that tornadoes did not strike cities. They believed that tornadoes did not cross rivers. They believed that tornadoes did not happen in the spring. Every one of those beliefs was shattered that day. The survivors of the Palm Sunday outbreak spent that night searching through the rubble by flashlight, listening for cries and moans. They spent the next morning digging out bodies, and they spent the next years trying to rebuild their lives and their towns. The memory of that day is seared into the landscape. In Dunlap, the church was never rebuilt. A small memorial now stands where the altar once was, a simple stone with the names of the 13 who died. In every town that was hit, there are still people who remember the green sky, the freight train roar, and the way the world turned upside down in a single terrible moment. But the Palm Sunday outbreak also did something else. It forced the U.S. Weather Bureau to change its ways. It led to the creation of the modern tornado warning system, with tornado watches and warnings broadcast on television and radio. It led to the birth of a new generation of storm spotters. And it taught us that spring storms are not to be underestimated. But on that afternoon, all that was in the future. For now, there was only the wind. And the wind carried with it the sound of everything breaking at once. In the town of Russia, Ohio, the tornado arrived without warning. The sky had been gray for most of the afternoon, but nothing that suggested the end of the world. A man named Harold was in his barn, milking his cow, when he heard a noise that he later described as 1,000 freight trains falling down a staircase. He stepped out of the barn and saw the funnel cloud less than a mile away, churning across the fields. It was not spinning smoothly, it was wobbling and pulsing as if it were alive and angry. Harold ran for the house, but the tornado was faster. It picked up the barn and threw it into the house, and then it threw the house into the pasture. Harold was thrown into a ditch, and when he looked up, he saw his cow flying through the air, lowing in terror. The cow landed in a tree, alive but stunned. Harold crawled out of the ditch and found that his legs were working, though his left arm was broken in 2 places. He walked for 2 miles through the debris, stepping over splintered boards and broken glass until he reached the town square. The square was gone. The general store was a pile of brick dust. The church was a frame of timbers leaning at crazy angles. The only building still standing was the bank, and that was because it had been built of limestone. Harold sat down on the curb and wept. In the town of Waldron, Michigan, the tornado struck at 5:30 in the afternoon. It was a small town, not even 1,000 people. Most of the men were still at work in the fields or at the factory in the next county. The women were home with the children preparing supper. The tornado came from the southwest, and it was not a single funnel but a family of 3 funnels dancing around each other like wrestlers. They touched down simultaneously on the edge of town and then merged into one massive column of black. It was a mile wide as the entire town. It didn't just hit Waldron, it swallowed it. The school was lifted off its foundation and dropped upside down into the playground. The grain elevator collapsed like a paper bag. The houses were peeled apart one by one as if they were being unzipped. The tornado threw a tractor into a water tower, and the water tower burst, flooding the main street with a wave of muddy water. A woman named Clara was hiding in her root cellar with her 3 children. She heard the roar above her and she felt the ground shake. She thought the cellar would cave in, but it held. When she finally opened the door, she saw nothing but sky. Her house was gone, her garden was gone, the neighbor's house was gone. The only landmark left was the foundation of her home, a concrete rectangle with the cellar opening. She and her children climbed out and walked through the rubble, stepping over the bodies of people they had known their whole lives. 9 people died in Waldron that day. The tornadoes kept moving northeast, crossing into Indiana again, then into Michigan, then into Ohio. They were not stopping. They were not weakening. In the town of Tontagony, Ohio, a man named Earl was driving home from work when he saw the sky turn the color of a bad bruise. He pulled over to the side of the road and watched as a funnel cloud descended from the clouds. It was not a thin rope. It was a massive wedge, wider than it was tall. It looked like a black wall moving across the landscape. Earl got out of his car and ran for a culvert under the road. He lay down in the culvert, covering his head with his hands. He felt the wind above him, the incredible pressure, and then he felt the car being lifted off the ground. When he looked up, the car was gone. The road was gone. The field behind him was gone, replaced by a flat expanse of mud. Earl walked for an hour before he found a farmhouse that was still standing. The farmer let him use the telephone, and Earl called his wife to tell her he was alive. She told him that their house had been destroyed, but the children were safe. They had taken shelter in the basement just in time. In the midst of all this destruction, there were moments of inexplicable survival. In the town of Pittsford, Michigan, a woman named Gladys was thrown out of her house and into a pond. She could not swim, but she grabbed hold of a floating piece of wood and kicked until she reached the shore. She crawled out of the pond and found that her dress was torn off and she was covered in mud. She walked naked to a neighbor's house, and the neighbor gave her a coat and a cup of coffee. Gladys later said that she had never been so scared in her life, but also never so thankful for a cup of coffee. In the town of Litchfield, Michigan, a man named Roy was working in his garage when the tornado lifted him up and threw him across the street. He landed in a pile of hay unharmed. He got up and walked back to his house, which was now a pile of rubble. He found a photograph of his wife in the debris still in its frame, not even scratched. He kept that photograph for the rest of his life. The storms did not end with the setting of the sun. As the daylight faded, the tornadoes continued to spin through the darkness, invisible but still deadly. In some places, the only warning was the sound, the roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. In the town of Bluffton, Indiana, a man named Leonard was listening to the radio when the broadcast was interrupted by a tornado warning. He told his wife to get the kids into the basement. She grabbed the baby and ran downstairs. Leonard followed, but he stopped to turn off the stove. The tornado hit while he was in the kitchen. It picked him up and threw him through the front door. He landed in the front yard, dazed but alive. The house was gone. The basement was open to the sky. His wife and children were still in the basement, buried under debris. Leonard dug with his bare hands, his fingers bleeding, until he found them. They were alive, huddled together under a mattress. They spent the rest of the night in the basement, listening to the wind howl. The morning after was a sight that no one who lived through it would ever forget. The sun rose on a landscape that had been transformed into a battlefield. Trees were snapped off at the base, stripped of their bark, lying in rows pointing southeast. Cars were wrapped around telephone poles. Houses were reduced to piles of splinters that looked like matchsticks. The smell was a mixture of wet wood, gasoline, and something else, something metallic and sweet. It was the smell of blood and dust. In the town of Dunlap, the survivors gathered in the field where the church had stood. They found Reverend Miller still alive, his arm in a sling made from a torn shirt. He stood among the rubble and led a prayer. He said the words that would be repeated in many towns that morning: "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." But some people could not pray. Some people just stood there, staring at the horizon, their eyes empty. In the days that followed, the Red Cross arrived, along with the National Guard and the Salvation Army. They set up tents and kitchens, distributed food and blankets, and helped with the search for the missing. The search went on for weeks. In some places, bodies were not found until the snow melted the next winter. The death toll climbed slowly as people who had been severely injured died in hospitals days or weeks later. The final count was 271, but it could have been much higher. Many people survived only because they had taken shelter in basements or cellars. Others survived because they were thrown clear of the debris. Still others survived because the tornado passed over them without touching the ground. The randomness of it all was terrifying. Some houses were completely destroyed while the house next door was untouched. Some people were killed in their homes, while others were spared because they were in the bathroom or the closet. The Palm Sunday outbreak was a wake-up call for the nation. It was the first time that tornadoes had been documented on such a massive scale. The U.S. Weather Bureau had been tracking storms for decades, but they had never seen anything like this. The storms had spawned tornadoes for hours on end, across multiple states in the spring, which was supposed to be a relatively quiet time for tornadoes. The old rules no longer applied. In the aftermath, there was a push to improve tornado forecasting. The Weather Bureau began to experiment with new technologies, including radar and satellite imagery. They also began to work with local law enforcement and amateur radio operators to create a network of storm spotters. This network would eventually become the basis for the modern tornado warning system, but it took years to develop. In the meantime, people in the Midwest learned to live with the fear. They built storm cellars, they listened to the radio, they watched the sky. For the survivors, the memory of that day never faded. They remembered the green sky, the roar, the way the pressure dropped and made their ears pop. They remembered the sounds of screaming and the sounds of silence. They remembered the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that there was nothing they could do but wait. In many towns, the rebuilding took years. In some towns, it never really happened. The population dwindled as people moved away, unable to bear the memories. The churches that were rebuilt held services in temporary buildings for years. The farmers who lost their barns had to borrow money to build new ones. The families who lost their homes moved in with relatives or rented trailers. Life went on, but it was different. The innocence was gone. In the decades that followed, the Palm Sunday outbreak became a part of the regional folklore. It was the storm that people compared to all other storms. When a new tornado warning was issued, someone would always say, "It's not as bad as 196.5." The survivors told their stories to their children and grandchildren, passing down the legend of the day the sky fell. And every spring, when the weather turned warm and the sky turned green, they would look up and remember. They would whisper a prayer. And they would hope that they would never see that terrible funnel again. But the wind never stops. It is always there, patient and waiting. In the spring of 1965, the wind reminded us that we are not in control. We build our houses, we plant our fields, we raise our children, but the wind can take it all away in a single moment. The Palm Sunday outbreak was a demonstration of nature's power, a reminder of our fragility. It was a warning and it was a tragedy. and it changed the way we think about the sky. Today, when you drive through the towns of the Midwest, you can still see the scars. In Dunlap, the memorial stands by the side of the road. In Goshen, a plaque marks the spot where the school was destroyed. In Waldron, the grain elevator was rebuilt, but it stands on a different spot, a few hundred feet away from the original foundation, which is still visible in the tall grass. The survivors are mostly gone now, but their stories live on. They live on in the newspapers, in the archives, in the memories of the children who heard them. And they live on in the weather forecasts, the warnings, the sirens that sound every spring. The Palm Sunday outbreak was not the deadliest tornado outbreak in history, and it was not the last. But it was the one that taught us the most. It taught us that the sky can change in an instant. It taught us that we must be prepared. And it taught us that even in the face of overwhelming destruction, there is something in the human spirit that refuses to give up. The people of the Midwest rebuilt, they survived, and they kept watching the sky. So when you hear the wind pick up, when you see the sky turn green, when you feel the pressure drop, remember the Palm Sunday outbreak. Remember the people who died, remember the people who lived, and then go to the basement, because the wind is always there waiting, and it does not forgive. In the years that followed, the people of the Midwest carried the weight of that Sunday in ways both visible and invisible. For some, the trauma manifested in small rituals. A farmer in Kendallville, Indiana, checked the sky 3 times every morning before he stepped into his fields. He never forgot the way the horizon had turned the color of a bruise, the way the air had gone still and heavy like the moment before a scream. He kept a transistor radio in his tractor cab, tuned to the weather band, and he taught his sons to do the same. They thought he was being foolish. They were young and they had not heard the roar. But he had, and he knew that memory was a kind of warning that never faded. The scientists who studied the outbreak were haunted by it too. In the offices of the U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., meteorologists pored over the data for months. They examined the surface charts, the upper air patterns, the satellite photographs that were still a novelty at the time. They traced the path of each tornado, mapping them like veins on a leaf, trying to understand why so many had formed and why they had been so violent. One of the key findings was the role of the jet stream. On that Palm Sunday, the jet stream had been unusually strong and had dipped far to the south, pulling warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico into the Midwest. At the same time, a cold front from Canada had collided with that warm air, creating the perfect conditions for supercell thunderstorms. The scientists realized that they had been underestimating the power of these atmospheric collisions. They had thought of tornadoes as isolated events, but the Palm Sunday outbreak showed them something else. It showed them that tornadoes could be part of a larger system, a kind of storm family that could last for hours and travel hundreds of miles. This new understanding led to changes in how the Weather Bureau issued warnings. Before 1965, tornado warnings were often vague and delayed. The Bureau was reluctant to cry wolf, afraid of causing panic. But after Palm Sunday, that reluctance began to fade. The Bureau started to issue warnings based on the conditions that had produced the outbreak, not just on the sighting of a funnel cloud. They developed what they called the Tornado Watch, an alert that would go out hours before any storm arrived, giving people time to prepare. The first official Tornado Watch was issued in 1966, just a year after the outbreak. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of a revolution in public safety. The National Weather Service, as it became known, also started to work more closely with amateur radio operators. These volunteers, known as storm spotters, became the eyes of the sky. They were trained to recognize the signs of a tornado, the rotating wall cloud, the lowering base, the debris cloud. They would report what they saw to the local weather office, and the office would issue warnings based on those reports. It was a system that relied on ordinary people, farmers and shopkeepers and retirees who were willing to stand in the rain and watch the sky so that others could seek shelter. In the towns that had been hit hardest, the rebuilding was slow and painful. In Dunlap, Indiana, the cornerstone of the new church was laid in the spring of 1966, exactly 1 year after the outbreak. The congregation had raised the money by selling quilts and holding bake sales, by taking out loans and asking for help from neighboring parishes. Reverend Miller, who had survived with a broken arm and a shattered faith, led the service. He stood on the same ground where he had prayed over the rubble, but this time the ground was clean. The new church was built of brick, not wood, with a reinforced foundation and a storm shelter in the basement. It was a practical decision, but it was also a statement. The church would stand and it would shelter the people when the wind came again. Not every town rebuilt. In some places, the devastation was so complete that the survivors simply walked away. The town of Rushville, Indiana, lost more than half its population in the months after the outbreak. The families who had lost everything packed what was left and moved to cities like Fort Wayne or Indianapolis, where they could find work and forget. The empty lots where houses had once stood became overgrown with weeds, and the only sign that people had ever lived there was the occasional foundation stone or a rusty mailbox. In the years that followed, the landscape of the Midwest was marked by these ghost towns, places where the tornado had not only destroyed buildings, but had erased the community itself. The children who lived through the outbreak grew up with a different understanding of the world. They were the generation that learned to look at the sky with suspicion. In school, they practiced tornado drills, lining up in the hallways with their heads down and their hands over their necks. They were taught that the safest place was a basement or an interior room, away from windows and exterior walls. They learned the difference between a watch and a warning, and they knew that the sirens that wailed every first Wednesday of the month were not just a test. They were a reminder that the wind could return at any moment. Some of these children became meteorologists, driven by a need to understand what had happened that day. Others became builders, constructing houses with safe rooms and steel beams. And some became parents who could not sleep on stormy nights, who would wake their own children and drag them to the basement, even when the radar showed nothing threatening. The Palm Sunday outbreak also had an impact on the insurance industry. After the outbreak, insurance companies faced a flood of claims, many of them for total losses. In some areas, premiums doubled overnight. Farmers who had lost their barns and their livestock found that they could not afford to rebuild. The federal government stepped in with disaster loans, but the money came with strings attached. The loans had to be repaid and the interest accumulated. Many families were still paying off the debt a decade later. The economic ripple effects were felt for years. In the towns that rebuilt, property values plummeted, and it took a generation for the market to recover. In the towns that did not rebuild, the tax base evaporated, and the schools and roads and other public services suffered. But the stories of survival were just as powerful as the stories of loss. There was the story of the young couple in Decatur, Indiana, who were married on Palm Sunday morning just hours before the storm. They had taken their wedding photos in the church, and then they had driven to a restaurant for the reception. The tornado hit while they were eating cake. The restaurant was destroyed, but the couple survived by huddling under a heavy oak table. They emerged from the rubble covered in plaster and frosting, but they were unharmed. They spent their wedding night in a shelter surrounded by strangers, but they always said that the storm had made their marriage strong. They celebrated their anniversary every year by going to a different town that had been hit by a tornado, volunteering with the Red Cross. They did this for 50 years, until they were too old to travel. Their story was a testament to the resilience of the human heart, the ability to find purpose in the worst moments. And there was the story of the teacher in Goshen, Indiana, who had been in the school when it collapsed. She had been pinned under a beam for hours, but she had kept her students calm by singing hymns. When the rescue workers finally pulled her out, she was still singing. She survived with a broken leg and a punctured lung, but her spirit was unbroken. She returned to teaching the next year in a temporary classroom set up in a church basement. She never talked about the storm, not directly, but her students noticed that she always kept a flashlight in her desk drawer, and that she would glance at the window whenever a cloud passed overhead. She taught generations of children to read and write, and she taught them something else as well. She taught them that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the will to keep going even when the fear is so big that it threatens to swallow you. In the decades that followed, the Palm Sunday outbreak became a benchmark for meteorologists and emergency managers. It was studied in university courses on severe weather, and its lessons were incorporated into the training of storm spotters. Every outbreak since then, from the super outbreak of 1974 to the tornadoes of 2011, has been compared to Palm Sunday. The numbers are always different, the death tolls and the damage estimates, but the pattern is the same. The storms form in the spring, when the cold air from the north meets the warm air from the south. The funnel drops from the green sky and the roar begins. The people take shelter and they wait and they hope. The technology has changed. Today we have Doppler radar that can detect the rotation inside a thunderstorm before a tornado ever touches the ground. We have satellite imagery that shows the movement of weather systems across the continent. We have mobile phone alerts and television cut-ins and sirens that wail at the first sign of danger. But the fear is still the same. It is the fear of a force that cannot be stopped, the fear of the wind. And the stories are still the same. They are stories of loss and survival, of the kindness of strangers and the strength of communities. They are stories that remind us that even when the sky falls, there is always a reason to get up the next morning. In the town of Bluffton, Indiana, the man named Leonard who had been thrown through his own front door, he never stopped talking about that night. He told his story to anyone who would listen, at the barbershop, in the hardware store, and the church potluck. He told it with a kind of awe, as if he still could not believe he had survived. He described the feeling of flying through the air, the sensation of being weightless and helpless at the same time. He talked about the moment he landed in the yard and how he had looked up and seen the house where his family was buried. He always paused at that part of the story, and he would look down at his hands, the same hands that had dug through the splinters and glass to find his wife and children. He lived to be 90 years old, and he died in his sleep, in a house that was built on a different lot, far from the place where the tornado had taken everything. On the day of his funeral, the sky was clear and blue, and the wind was barely a whisper. The preacher talked about the storm, of course, because it was impossible to talk about Leonard without talking about the storm. The man had been shaped by it as surely as the landscape had been shaped. He had been bent and broken, but he had not been destroyed. And in that, he was like the people of the whole region. They had been bent and broken, but they had not been destroyed. The Palm Sunday outbreak is not a story of a single day. It is a story that continues to unfold. Every time a new family moves into a town that was rebuilt, every time a child learns the drill, every time someone looks up at a green sky and feels the drop in pressure. It is a story that lives in the soil, in the grain elevators that were rebuilt on new foundations, in the memorials that stand by the roadside, in the scars that remain on the trees. It is a story that will never be finished because the wind never stops. But it is also a story of hope because the people never stop either. They keep rebuilding, they keep praying, they keep watching. And every spring, when the first storm of the season rolls across the plains, they go to the basements and the safe rooms and they wait. They wait for the roar to pass and they wait for the silence that follows. And then they step out into the aftermath, ready to begin again. But even as they stepped out into the aftermath, ready to begin again, there were those who could never fully shake the feeling that the sky was watching them. The survivors carried the storm inside them like a second heartbeat, a rhythm of fear and hope that pulsed beneath the surface of their daily lives. For some, that pulse became a call to action. They became the storm spotters who would drive toward the clouds while everyone else fled. They became the radio operators who relayed reports of funnel sightings, the ham radio enthusiasts who spent their evenings practicing codes and procedures, waiting for the day when their skills would be needed again. One such man was Robert, a farmer from near Angola, Indiana. He had lost his entire crop to the Palm Sunday tornadoes, along with his barn and 3 of his horses. But he had also lost something more elusive, his peace of mind. For months after the storm, he could not sleep through a cloudy night. He would lie in bed, listening to the wind, feeling the pressure of the air against the windows. His wife said he would sometimes scream out in his sleep, shouting for his family to get to the cellar, even though they were already safe in the bedroom beside him. Then one evening, a neighbor who was a volunteer firefighter told him about a new program that the National Weather Service was starting. It was called Skywarn, and it trained ordinary citizens to recognize the signs of a tornado, to measure wind speed and hail size, and to report what they saw to the authorities. Robert signed up without hesitation. He attended every class, took notes in a spiral notebook, and passed the certification test on his first try. From then on, whenever a severe thunderstorm watch was issued, Robert would climb into his pickup truck, grab his handheld radio, and drive to a high spot on the county road where he could see the horizon in every direction. He would sit there for hours, watching the clouds build, noting the rotation, the hail streaks, the sudden stillness that preceded the worst. He did this for over 30 years, until his arthritis made it impossible to grip the steering wheel. He never saw another tornado after that day, but he reported dozens of funnel clouds and wall clouds that helped the Weather Service issue warnings that saved lives. He died with the radio still on his bedside table, tuned to the local ham frequency, ready for the call that never came. Robert's story was repeated across the Midwest in the years after 1965. The Palm Sunday outbreak had shown the value of trained observers. In the aftermath, the number of volunteer storm spotters exploded. The Red Cross and the Weather Bureau began organizing formal training sessions, often held in high school auditoriums or church basements that themselves had been rebuilt after the storms. The classes were packed with farmers, truck drivers, housewives, school teachers, and retired veterans. They came because they had seen what the wind could do and they wanted to be part of the solution. They wanted to give their communities a fighting chance. The program that grew out of that effort became the backbone of America's severe weather warning system, a network of eyes on the ground that complemented the radar beams reaching into the sky. And every one of those eyes carried a memory of April 11, 1965, a date that had burned itself into their minds like a brand. The scientific community also took the outbreak as a wake-up call. For years, meteorologists had known that tornadoes formed in association with mesocyclones, the rotating updrafts within supercell thunderstorms. But the Palm Sunday outbreak provided a wealth of data that helped refine the understanding of how those mesocyclones developed and how they could be detected before a tornado touched ground. Researchers from the University of Chicago and the National Severe Storms Laboratory pored over the radar film from that day, looking for patterns. They discovered something chilling. In many cases, the radar had shown a hook-shaped echo on the trailing edge of the storm, a signature that indicated strong rotation and the potential for a tornado. But in 1965, few forecasters had been trained to recognize that hook. The technology existed, but the knowledge did not. After Palm Sunday, the National Weather Service made it a priority to teach its forecasters how to read the radar images for that telltale hook. They developed new algorithms and protocols for issuing warnings. They also pushed for the installation of more radar stations across the Midwest, closing the gaps in coverage that had left so many communities blind on that terrible day. By the early 1970s, the network of weather surveillance radars known as WSR-57 was operational across most of the tornado-prone states. But even with better radar, warnings were still slow to reach the public. In 1965, many towns had relied on a single siren, and if the power was out, the siren was silent. Radio stations could broadcast warnings, but only if they were on the air at the time, and on a Sunday afternoon, many stations had signed off for the day. The outbreak led to a push for more robust emergency communication systems. Communities began installing redundant siren networks with battery backups and automatic activation triggers. Television stations started using crawl banners and emergency interruption systems. The idea of a tornado drill became a regular part of school life, even in states where tornadoes were rare. The Palm Sunday outbreak changed not just the science, but the culture of weather preparedness. In the small town of Rushville, Indiana, the lessons were written in concrete and steel. After the tornado destroyed the high school, the community decided to rebuild with a safe room capable of holding the entire student body. The new school had walls poured 12 inches thick, reinforced with rebar, and a roof that could withstand winds of over 200 miles per hour. The safe room was also used as the gymnasium, so it had multiple functions, but its primary purpose was survival. When the sirens sounded, the students would file into the gym in perfect order, the same order they had practiced in the drills. The teachers would take roll call, the lights would dim, and the community would wait. That safe room is still standing today, a silent monument to the fear and foresight of that generation. And it has been used, not just for tornadoes, but for severe thunderstorms, for ice storms, for any emergency that called for shelter. The children who filed into that gym grew up knowing that safety was not a given. It was something that had to be built, maintained, and practiced. The economic scars took longer to heal. In the towns that were hit hardest, the tax base had evaporated overnight. Schools had to consolidate, merging districts that had once been proud and independent. Farmers who had lost their grain bins and livestock struggled to make payments on loans that had been taken out before the storm. The federal disaster loans helped, but they created a burden that lasted for decades. Some families simply walked away. They packed what remained of their belongings into cars and trucks and drove west, to states where tornadoes were less frequent, or north, to the cities where they could find factory jobs. The depopulation of rural areas already underway in the 1960s was accelerated by the tornadoes. The small towns that survived did so by sheer force of will. They held potluck dinners to raise money for the new library. They organized volunteer crews to rebuild the grain elevator. They hosted dances in the high school gym, the same gym that had been a shelter during the storm, and they danced until the floor was slick with sweat and the band had packed up their instruments. They refused to let their towns die. And then there were the children who had huddled in bathrooms and under desks, who had heard the roar and felt the pressure change, who had seen their homes turn to splinters. They grew up and had children of their own, and they taught those children to be afraid of the sky. But they also taught them how to face that fear. They taught them to watch the western horizon for green clouds, to listen for the sound of a freight train, to feel the stillness that comes before the storm. They taught them that the sirens were not just a test. They were a message from the past, a warning that the wind could return at any moment, and that the only way to survive was to be ready. In the years that followed, the Palm Sunday outbreak became a touchstone for the unfolding science of tornado climatology. Researchers began to look at the patterns of outbreak days, asking why so many tornadoes had occurred on that particular day, in that particular region. They discovered that a powerful jet stream had swept a cold front across the Midwest, colliding with a mass of warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico. The atmosphere was unstable, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The storms that formed were supercells, rotating thunderstorms that could produce tornadoes for hours at a time. One supercell in Indiana produced a family of at least 4 tornadoes over a path of more than 80 miles. Another in Ohio spawned a tornado that tracked for over 30 miles, cutting a swath through farmland and subdivisions. The outbreak was a textbook example of what could happen when the atmospheric ingredients came together in just the right way. Today, meteorologists use computer models to predict such outbreaks days in advance. They can see the jet stream patterns, the moisture levels, the instability indices, and they can issue watches before the first cloud even forms. But the models are not perfect. There is still an element of surprise, a residual uncertainty that keeps forecasters humble. They know that for all their technology, the atmosphere still holds secrets. They know that on a spring afternoon, the sky can change in minutes, and the green color that signals a large hail core can also be a sign of something worse. They know that the sound of a freight train is still the most reliable indicator of a tornado on the ground, because ears hear what radar sometimes misses. The Palm Sunday outbreak also changed the way that communities thought about memorials. In the first years after the storm, the survivors erected simple wooden crosses by the side of the road, marking the spots where their loved ones had died. Some of those crosses are still there, weathered to a pale gray, the names barely readable. Over time, more formal memorials arose. In Dunlap, Indiana, the site of the tragic school collapse, a granite monument was placed near the rebuilt elementary school. It lists the names of the children and teachers who died, and it is surrounded by a small garden of flowers and trees. Every year on April 11th, a ceremony is held at that monument. The survivors come, now in their 70s and 80s, leaning on canes and walkers. They stand in silence as the names are read aloud. The schoolchildren of today attend, dressed in their best clothes, bearing wreaths and flags. They have been taught the story by their teachers, who were taught by teachers who were there. The memory is passed down like a torch, a light that illuminates the darkness of that day. But there are other memorials, less formal but no less powerful. They are found in the photographs that hang in living rooms, the sepia-toned images of homes that no longer exist. They are found in the scars on the trees, the twisted limbs, and the bark that never fully healed. They are found in the stories told by grandparents to grandchildren, the tales of running from the devil wind, of finding a shoe in a field miles from the house, of hearing the cries of neighbors beneath the rubble. These memorials are not carved in stone, but they are etched into the collective memory of the region. They form a repository of wisdom that is passed from generation to generation. As the decades rolled on, the Palm Sunday outbreak faded from the front pages. New disasters took its place. The 1974 super outbreak, the 1999 Oklahoma tornadoes, the devastating 2011 season. Each new outbreak was compared to Palm Sunday, not because it was the largest or the deadliest. It was not. With a death toll of over 250, it was eclipsed by later events, but because it was the first to be so thoroughly documented and so thoroughly studied. It was the first outbreak that truly changed the way we think about tornadoes. It was the first that forced the government, the scientific community, and the public to take the threat seriously. In that sense, it was a turning point, a moment when the nation looked at the devastation and decided that it would not happen again the same way. The sky did not stop producing tornadoes. The wind did not learn compassion, but the people learned. They learned to build stronger. They learned to watch more carefully. They learned to warn with speed and precision. The Palm Sunday outbreak taught them all of that, and it taught them something else as well. That even in the worst of times, there is a bond between people that cannot be broken by any wind. The survivors who dug their neighbors out of the debris did not stop being neighbors when the rebuilding was done. They remained connected, tied together by the shared experience of facing the abyss and coming back. They formed friendships that lasted a lifetime, friendships that were forged in the chaos of that day. They attended each other's weddings, celebrated the births of grandchildren, sat beside each other in hospital rooms and nursing homes. The storm had brought them together in a way that nothing else could. So when we remember the Palm Sunday outbreak of 1965, we remember the destruction, yes. We remember the lives cut short, the homes turned to piles of rubble, the fields strewn with wreckage. But we also remember the courage. We remember the teacher who sang hymns while pinned beneath a beam. We remember the young couple who spent their wedding night in a shelter and went on to spend 50 years helping others. We remember the farmer who became a storm spotter and the children who grew up to become meteorologists and the communities that refused to fade away. We remember that the wind is powerful, but it is not all-powerful. The human spirit, fragile as it is, has a resilience that the sky cannot defeat, and so the story goes on. Every spring when the first line of thunderstorms rolls across the plains, the people of the Midwest look to the sky. They check the radar on their phones, they listen for the sirens, they gather their families and head to the basement. They are not the same people who lived through 1965, but they carry the legacy of that day in their habits and their hearts. They know that safety is never guaranteed, but they know also that preparation saves lives. They know that the memory of a single day can change a region, can change a nation, can change the way that humanity faces the most violent force on Earth. And they know that the wind will come again. It is only a matter of time, but when it does, they will be ready. They will step into the basements and the safe rooms and they will wait and they will hope and they will survive. And then they will step out into the aftermath ready to begin again. And so the story goes on. The Palm Sunday outbreak of 1965 did not just change the way that meteorologists predicted tornadoes or the way that communities built their schools. It changed the way that people thought about time itself. For the survivors, time was no longer measured in hours or days, but in the space between one breath and the next, one storm season and another. They learned that the future was not a distant promise but a fragile thing that could be snatched away in an instant. And yet they also learned that the future could be rebuilt, grain by grain, brick by brick, story by story. In the towns that were hit hardest, the recovery took years. The physical scars faded, but the emotional ones remained like phantom limbs, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Some survivors found solace in faith, a rekindled trust in God that had been shaken but not destroyed. Others found meaning in service, joining volunteer fire departments or emergency response teams. A few became activists, pushing for stronger building codes and more funding for weather research. Each survivor carried a different burden, but they all shared a common understanding that the wind was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be respected. The children of the survivors grew up with a heightened awareness of the sky. They learned to read the clouds the way their parents had learned to read the land. They knew that a greenish tint to the air meant trouble, and that a sudden stillness after rain was not peace but a warning. They passed this knowledge to their own children who passed it to theirs. In this way, the lessons of Palm Sunday became woven into the cultural fabric of the Midwest, just as deeply as the lessons of the Dust Bowl or the great floods of the Mississippi. And the science continued to advance. By the early 21st century, meteorologists were using Doppler radar to detect rotation within storms, and the average lead time for a tornado warning had risen from 3 minutes to almost 15. The number of false alarms decreased and the number of lives saved increased. But the system was not infallible. The Palm Sunday outbreak had taught the experts that the atmosphere was a chaos system, that even the best models could miss a crucial detail. They had learned to be humble. They had learned that the wind could always surprise them. Today, when a severe weather outbreak is forecast, the entire region prepares. Schools hold drills. Hospitals activate emergency protocols. Television stations interrupt normal programming to show live radar. And in the basements and safe rooms of the farmhouses and suburban homes, families sit with flashlights and weather radios waiting. They know the statistics. They know that most warnings do not produce a tornado. But they also know the story of Palm Sunday when the warnings came too late for too many. They know that waiting is a small price to pay for the chance to live. As the years pass, the direct memory of the outbreak fades. The survivors grow older and their voices grow quieter. The places where the tornadoes touched down have been rebuilt so many times that only the oldest residents remember the way it used to be. But the legacy remains. It is present in the sirens that test every Wednesday at noon. It is present in the emergency plans that every school district updates each fall. It is present in the quiet words of a grandmother telling her grandchild to come inside because a storm is coming. The Palm Sunday outbreak of 1965 was not the first great tornado disaster, and it would not be the last. But it was the one that taught a generation the hard lesson of preparedness. It was the one that showed a nation that nature does not care about human schedules or human dreams. It was the one that forced a new way of thinking, a new way of building, a new way of warning. And in that sense, it was the one that saved more lives than it took. So the story does not end. It lives on in every safe room that is built, every weather radio that is purchased, every child who learns to crouch down and cover their head. It lives on in the faces of the survivors, now aged and wise, who will tell you that they do not fear the wind but they respect it. And when you ask them what they want the world to remember, they will say, remember that the wind can come at any moment. Remember that you are not helpless. Remember that you are part of a community that will help you rise. And remember that the green sky, the freight train roar, and the shaking ground are not the end of the story. They are just the beginning of a new chapter, written by the strong, the brave, and the resilient. That is the message of the Palm Sunday outbreak. That is the lesson that the sky gave to the people of the Midwest and that the people gave back to the world. And it is a lesson that will be taught and retold as long as the wind blows and the clouds gather on an April afternoon, because the wind will always return. But so will the people. And that is the one thing that no tornado can ever take away.